Instructions for accessing subtitles in a language other than English are included on our board meetings webpage as well as in the description below. Instrucciones para acceder a los subtítulos en un idioma que no sea el inglés se incluyen en nuestra página web de reuniones de la Junta, así como en la descripción a continuación.
Bye.
Good evening, and thank you for joining us. It is January 8th, 2025 at 5:47. I'm calling the Ross Valley School District Board of Trustees special meeting to order. At this time, we have board trustees present. We have Daniel Cassidy, Shelley Hamilton, Chris Lamos-Cobb, and myself, Rachel Litwack. We also have our superintendent, Tyler Grapp, here tonight. This meeting is here at the Ross Valley School District office at Shaw Drive, and with our meeting called to order, I will move on to our procedural items. The first one there is the Pledge of Allegiance. So if you would like to stand and join me, let's do so. I pledge
allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. And the next item is to adopt the agenda and time allocations. Did we have any board members who would like to make alterations, changes? If not, I'll entertain a motion.
I will make a motion to adopt the agenda and time allocations as noted.
Second. Motion and second, Chris.
Aye.
Shelley?
Aye.
Daniel?
Aye.
And Rachel, aye. All right, we have an agenda for this evening. The next item is presentation and action items. Our first item under this is public comment regarding items on the open session agenda. We are only taking comments on our special meeting agenda items tonight, so they need to be focused on the item as listed in number 2, which is board discussion for the purpose of giving direction to the superintendent regarding parcel tax renewal. So I have one comment card. If anybody would like to add one, I'm happy to take them. Just pass one over to Teresa over here. But right now I have Christina.
Hello, Happy New Year. So I'm Christina Workman, RVTA co-VP and 3rd and 4th grade teacher at Hidden Valley. I'd like to thank Superintendent Graff for his presentation Monday morning with the staff, really laying out the parcel tax, like the needs of why we need the parcel tax and why it's important. Just your continued transparency speaks volumes, and it means so much to all of us. So thank you very, very much. RVTA supports the parcel tax. We are behind the board and our superintendent. We're on board and united and working together. We realize how vital it is that this parcel tax passes, and we want to make sure that we're working together to make it clear to our community how vital and critical it is that we do pass this parcel tax. We understand that the parcel tax doesn't pass, then major cuts will happen, and our amazing qualified teachers will be forced to look for other jobs. We need to pay qualified teachers, our current qualified teachers. We need to be able to pay people rolling out new curriculum. We need teacher leadership. We need to be able to retain the teachers that we have, and our teachers, as we've been saying for the last few years now, we need to be paid a livable wage, and we know that the parcel tax is really our only answer for that. It's imperative that this parcel tax passes and we're ready to work together. Thank you.
Thank you, Christine. Last chance, anybody else? All right, so moving on, is the next item, which is board discussion for the purpose of giving direction to the superintendent regarding parcel tax renewal.
Great.
Turn it over to you, Doug.
Yeah, so tonight we have Charles Heath with Team Civics, who's going to talk to us a little bit about some of the conversation we had at the December board meeting around making decisions around per parcel or per square foot, senior exemption, inflation rate, all those questions that we had at the end of that presentation. Charles will bring his expertise into the room, share his perspective, and we can ask and answer questions from Charles on that. So welcome, Charles.
Sure, thank you. Good evening, I am Charles Heath. I'm a partner with Team Civics. We are consultants that work with most of the school districts here in Marin County and many school districts around the state to design and pass revenue measures. We work on a lot of bond measures and parcel taxes. We've worked for TAM Union High School District here and most of the other feeder districts that feed into TAM and the other districts here in Marin as well. We've been working on this for a little less than a month now. I think we were brought on board in mid-December. So Tyler was gracious enough to spend some time with us to kind of get us up to speed on some of the conversations that the board has been having to date, some of the decision points that you all are wrestling with, and the potential timelines if we want to have a measure on the ballot as soon as the May 2025 special mail-in ballot election. So I've put together some thoughts that I'm happy to share with you based on my perspective as I've kind of looked at the options. I've also had conversations with Brian Godby about the survey research that he conducted last summer when you were thinking about potentially putting something on the November 2024 ballot. So I have the benefit of all of that data and Brian's conclusions. And also happy to talk to you about just timeline and process from here, right? So most immediately, I think what we need to do is come out of tonight's meeting with some direction from you all in terms of what are the key components of the parcel tax that you want us to bring back to you in the form of a resolution at your January. Ticking away on us here, so we want to be able to work on that and bring back something that hopefully we have consensus on. As part of that, I thought I would kind of walk you through what I see as the key decision points around tax rate, duration, the potential uses of funds, whether or not to include a cost of living adjustment, and if so, how much, kind of each of those key decision points that would then help inform the creation of the resolution. And then beyond that, we can also talk about communication strategies and the transition to an independent advocacy campaign if you were to put the measure on the ballot. So that's sort of the framing. Anything else you all want to make sure that I cover this evening? Or should we start there?
Sounds good to
The
me.
only other point, which I'm sure you'll cover, is the per parcel versus per square foot decision.
Yep. We'll definitely. And why don't we actually start there? Because I think probably the most challenging decision in front of you here is how do you choose an appropriate rate, right? And as you might imagine, for a parcel tax that requires a 2/3 vote to pass, choosing a rate that the community generally perceives as affordable and appropriate is probably the most important decision you'll make in all this. As you probably know, the vast majority of school parcel taxes, both in Marin County and throughout the state, are like your current parcel tax, just a simple per parcel methodology. Increasingly, we've seen some school districts moving away from that. There was a state Supreme Court decision last year in 2024 that sort of opened the door for allowing more latitude in how you can structure parcel taxes using different methodologies, including the per square foot option. The primary benefit of the per square foot approach is that it means that the larger properties within your district that have greater square footage but may be on a single parcel or a few parcels, they end up paying proportionally more under that methodology than they would under the per parcel rate. And when we run the numbers, I'll go through these with you in a minute, we definitely see that when you move from a per parcel approach to a per square foot approach, it brings the cost for the average single family home down because a greater portion of the burden is being borne by those non-residential parcels. So that's the primary benefit. I think there's good arguments to be made that it's a more equitable approach to assessing the tax. The downside of the per square foot approach is that it's more complicated, right? When on a per parcel basis, it's really easy for me to understand as a homeowner how much it's going to cost me every year. On the per square foot approach, I got to do some math, and I also have to know how big my property is and some of those factors to get at the numbers.
Charles, is it the property size or square footage of the house?
So you can do it either way legally. What we find in virtually all cases is that it's based on the building square footage, so the improvements that are on that parcel, not the lot size as a whole. And the reason for that is that there's some correspondence between the size of the building and student generation and factors like that. Lot sizes are all over the map, and you can have some very small homes on a very big hillside property, and it's just hard to rationalize why that should drive the cost.
I would just think people know their square footage of the house. They don't know how big my parcel lot is. So I think that's almost easier, even though it's more complicated than per parcel. Knowing the square footage of the house is easier.
Yeah, it's the number that comes to mind more easily than your lot size for sure. Yep. So let me just kind of walk you through our thinking as we've looked at the numbers. So my understanding is we're trying to do two things with this parcel tax. One is we want to renew the funding that you receive under your current parcel tax, which this year I believe is about $4.7 million. And what we're looking at here for a measure that we would place on the May 2025 ballot, it would actually take effect in the 25-26 fiscal year, right, on the property tax bills for that year. So we actually need to look ahead at what would your parcel tax generate in that 25-26 year, because that's what we're asking voters to consider. And by my estimation, with that 3% increase, it would be about 4.85 million next year, okay? So just to keep you whole, to generate 4.85 million, we also need to account for the fact that you currently offer a senior exemption, and it looks like about 25% of the single family residential parcels in your district are currently qualifying for the exemption. So we need to account for that when we do our math. Next year, the per parcel rate that would be required to generate that 4.85 million is about $720 per parcel, okay? If we were to shift that to a square footage methodology and account for those exemptions, I estimate that we would need a tax rate of 32 cents per square foot to generate that same amount of money after exemptions. If we apply that 32 cents per square foot to the average single family residential square footage in your district, which is 1,901 square feet, that results in a tax rate for the average property of $608 per year. So you can see 608 compared to 720, we're seeing that benefit of moving to the square footage approach for that typical single family residence. So 32 cents is what would be required just to keep you whole. And then that could continue to adjust by 3% or whatever factor we choose going into the future. I also understand that in order to address your budget need, you're trying to generate an additional approximately $3 million, right? So $3 million applied to your taxable square footage, accounting for exemptions, requires an additional tax rate of 20 cents per square foot, okay? So that would be a total of 52 cents per square foot. That additional 20 cents applied to that $1,900 average square foot is an additional $380, right? For a total of $988 would be the total tax rate under the 52 cents per square foot for that average single family home. By comparison, if we were doing this on a per parcel basis, the additional $3 million would require an increase in the tax rate of $445 to a total of $1,165. Okay, so 1,165 compared to 988. That's the differential that we see when we move to square footage compared to per parcel. So on the whole, I think just thinking about the sort of how do we optimize this measure politically to maximize support, I think the square footage approach likely is beneficial to you, even though it is more complicated.
And I agree, it's the complication part that worries me the most. That could be the killer for voters to actually vote yes or no, right? And so in your experience and what you've seen districts move to, can you provide us any type of guidance on what other districts have done to really simplify the voter experience, to be able to see clearly that this makes sense on so many levels
Sure.
per square foot?
Yeah, it requires as part of your messaging. I mean, part of your messaging is going to be, why do you need this revenue, right? And you're the lowest funded district in Marin County on a per student basis, and you have a lot of good messages that you can use to make the case, and the need to stay competitive on salaries for attracting and retaining teachers and other staff. But you have to add to that the messaging around why this methodology makes sense, because we're changing methodology, right? And why are we doing that? And that's where I think the equity argument around this is more equitable structure. It reduces the cost for the average homeowner in the community. And I would really use those numbers focused on the average square footage in the community to kind of ground people in some real numbers. Now, some people, averages are averages because half are above and half are below, right? So we'll also, the square footage of every property in your district is public record. So as part of the campaign, we can access that data, answer questions for people so that they know concretely how much this is going to cost them, and take some of the mystery out of it.
That second part, that last sentence, do you think it might be beneficial to have some type of resource in place for people to call and have that calculation given to them? Do we have something?
Yeah, it's basically, it's a spreadsheet. So a couple things we could do is, one, we could make that available to district staff to be able to answer that question if it comes up. Because that's factual information. The district can always provide factual information, just can't advocate once the measure's on the ballot.
Right.
We've also, in some instances, created a calculator that we can put on your either district website or the campaign website, where people can go in and we'll do the math for them. You plug in your address and it tells you, here's how much it's going to cost
Perfect.
you. So there's
That's
some
good.
tools there.
Okay, thank
So we could tie it in with that county data about not just, my home is 2,200 square feet, let me just multiply that by 0.52. Okay.
Yeah, you can tie it to the address.
And we could also, you could also do the reverse re-engineered math and say, if this was done on a per parcel basis, it would cost $1,165, which would be equivalent to a homeowner of whatever it turns out to be. Anyone who owns homes larger than that would pay a bit more, and if your house was less than that, it's a simplified kind of way of saying putting a cutoff line, and the equity argument of that as well.
And is there a cap that you'd recommend? Like not over, I just doubled that to like a 3,800 square foot house, and I don't know what the house sizes go, but I know down Butterfield there's some presumably large houses.
Yeah, so we looked at the cap, and in the polling that you did, it assumed that there was a cap. I think it was around 10,000 square feet, and we had someone run the data on how many parcels in your district that cap would apply to, and there were only 30 parcels in the whole. You have 9,000 taxable parcels, only 30 would qualify under the cap.
Over 10,000 square foot homes.
Yeah, there was one residential property. The rest were all non-residential, so commercial or like larger apartment or condo complexes. So my advice, one of the challenges with the cap is that now all of a sudden you have this other number that's in the ballot question, right? You can either phrase it in terms of a square footage cap or a dollar cap, and it's the equivalent either way. But it complicates the ballot question, and we've tested this in polling side by side. And when you add that cap, that additional complexity, people start asking themselves, well, this is going to cost somebody a couple $1,000s a year, not the whatever $988 they're telling me. And doubt is not your friend in these elections. So given that it only applies to 30 parcels and one residence,
just let it.
I would simplify it and just remove the cap.
Yeah.
And then how does it work with apartment complexes? Like, they would have to pay that large amount potentially if it went through?
They would pay the larger amount, yes, just simply based on their square footage. But if you assume that apartment complex has 15 units, then they're going to take that amount, divide it by 15, then divide it again by 12 months and pass that through in rent to the extent that they're able to. The market will bear it.
And again, it sounds like the other piece of the message is that it's really the size of the building, the number of bedrooms that drives the impact on the school district in terms of the number of potential families and students who live in them. So from an explanation perspective, that's whether it's an apartment or a house.
Right.
So would somebody in an apartment, in that case, pay less than they're paying today?
Well, if you're in an apartment and you don't pay property taxes, you don't currently pay for a parcel tax
Correct.
and you wouldn't in the future. So it would just be a
But
pass through
it
from
gets
your
passed
landlord.
through, so what's the assumption for people in apartments that pass through?
It's really hard to figure it out because I mean ultimately rents are market driven more so than just pass through of costs. So, but under this methodology, it is going to cost those apartment buildings more to the landlord, and to the extent that they pass it through is it's hard for us to estimate that in any accurate way.
Are there any, I'm sorry, go ahead.
It is done on a per square foot basis, so it shouldn't really matter if a landlord passes through an actual expense, then they're passing through the exact per square foot cost to a renter that a homeowner would be absorbing as well, from an equitable, like from everybody getting the same.
And maybe I'm splitting hairs here or not, but think about the affordable housing units, individuals who really don't have a lot of delta to have a rental raise. What have other districts done for those buildings? And we're looking at a parcel, do those landlords get capped so that those tenants that are getting a break in rent aren't hurt?
Yeah, there's no way to offer an exemption for low-income properties or something to that effect. The only exemptions that are allowed are for the property owner, not for a tenant, because the tenants aren't paying property taxes, and they can only be offered based on age, or if the property owner qualifies for low-income disability benefits. That's all the state law allows. So we don't have many tools there. You could potentially, look at your profile of parcels and say, okay, of our multifamily dwellings, how do we isolate a category of those where we do want to apply a cap to try to mitigate this? But I think again, we're talking about 30 parcels total that we even qualify.
Yeah.
So we're really trying to thread the needle to develop something that achieves that outcome.
Yeah. Okay.
Of those 30, how many of them are like commercial versus like rental spaces? Do you have any idea of that?
I have that database. I don't know off the top of my head, but I can get you that information.
So I'm just thinking maybe there's a way to do it like number of living units per parcel, then you can kind of get it that way, because I think the ones are probably like over 100 would likely have low income, and you could maybe cap it for those ones. Could you do that? Do something like that, or just cap it in general for living number of units or something?
I mean, we couldn't tie the tax methodology to dwelling units. It would have to be based on either square footage or parcels. Yeah.
So it's pretty limited.
Yeah.
Have you ever seen it done on per bedroom? I know some planning departments do certain regulations based on number of bedrooms in a.
Yeah, I mean, state law for school district parcel taxes, it has to be based either on square footage or parcels. We don't really have another way to assess the tax. Yeah. So it's not perfect because we only have so many tools.
Yeah.
The other thing to think about related to the square footage option is that you do have, I think it's about 900 parcels in your district that are unimproved, so they're vacant parcels. Under your current parcel tax, they're assessed the same rate as everybody else. In the square footage methodology, you have some flexibility, because how do you apply a square footage parcel tax to a parcel that has no square footage? So typically what's done is you have a separate rate category for unimproved parcels. In your polling, you tested a $199 rate for those unimproved parcels. To me, that feels high for these properties that aren't generating. So I think a number that would be more in the $75 to $95 rate range would probably be more palatable. And again, if you think about the voter that's just quickly reading through this ballot proposal, they're trying to digest multiple numbers. And the more you can keep those numbers in a palatable range, the better reaction you're going to get.
And what are those vacant parcels paying today?
They're just the same rate as everybody else, because it's just purely based on the per parcel rate.
So
Every parcel is treated equally.
Wow.
it's a $698.
$699, yeah.
Yeah.
And vacant means
No building.
No buildings.
Nobody lives there, the house is for sale, or that's just a term that.
There's no improvements on the property, so it's just raw land.
Yeah, oh,
Just land.
just land.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
And sometimes you'll have situations where there's a home that's been divided into two parcels, but that other parcel doesn't have anything built on it, so that's counting as one of those vacant parcels, right?
So the number that we got for the square foot, the 52 cents a square foot, that's backed in with the 900 ones pulled out. Obviously, if we change that rate, or
Yeah, so I for the numbers I gave you earlier, I assume $95 per vacant parcel, just to get to those numbers.
Okay.
But again, because there's not many and the rate's relatively low, it doesn't move the needle a lot in terms of the overall revenue.
And this includes the 25% senior opt-out?
It does. Yeah, all these numbers factor in the exemption.
And these exemptions seem to me not to have that much of an impact on our overall goal of the $4.85, right?
Well, it's 25% of your residential parcels. So, I mean, it does have it's several $100,000 a year in revenue. And it just means that when you factor in those exemptions, you have to raise the rate to generate the same amount of revenue.
Okay, all right.
And in talking to neighbors who would be interested in that exemption, how do we promote that? How do we, because from people I've talked to, sometimes it's complicated, and I think it just goes through the tax assessor's office. But is there a way to make that easier for our exemption population to know that they can still vote yes because it's easy to exempt, or everybody's just automatically qualified out, which I wouldn't want to do? So
it's actually the school district that administers the exemption. And I don't know how you currently promote the senior exemption, or if you do. By law, if seniors apply for the exemption once, it has to be carried forward each year for the life of the tax. So you can't make them reapply every year.
Okay, that's easier.
Yep. And, I often see that, in the course of promoting a tax like this and going through the campaign process, a big portion of that will be focused messaging to senior citizens about the availability of the exemption. Now, it's a double-edged sword, because that's probably going to result in more exemptions, which is going to cost you revenue, but those are also important votes to get to the 2/3 mark. Yeah. But, many school districts on an ongoing basis will have, an annual communication to senior homeowners to say, the deadline's coming up to apply for this exemption. Typically, there's a deadline in kind of the May timeframe so that you can receive those and process the exemptions before the property tax bills go out in the fall. But the district is responsible for preparing the levy roll that gets provided to the county assessor to then add to the property tax bills.
Okay.
And that's going to get a lot more complicated if you're in a square footage methodology, because it's no longer just, taking $720 and applying it to all the parcels except the exemptions. You have to calculate it for each one. So most school districts that have a square footage based parcel tax, they have a third party professional administrator that prepares those tax rolls for them.
And that's just an additional cost we would have to do every year? Or is it just the one time?
You need to do it annually, because potentially there could be changes in square footage from year to year. Your exemptions will change from year to year, so it needs to be updated annually. And I can refer you to firms that do that kind of work for other districts in the area.
Just curious, what does that cost a district per year?
I don't have a good sense of that, to be honest. I can find out for you. And it's going to scale with the number of, with the size of the district and the number of parcels.
Okay.
But we can get you an estimate for that.
Less than $3 million.
That's good.
So those are some thoughts on the rate. The other, I think, considerations are the duration of the measure. So in the polling that you conducted last summer, it assumed a measure that would continue until ended by voters, so essentially in perpetuity parcel tax. It's interesting because in your polling, when negative messages were tested, the number one negative, it was, this is a forever tax that is going to go on, and we kind of, as voters, we lose control over it. Given that you're looking to increase the rate fairly substantially here, I would advise not going for a permanent tax and putting a duration on it. I think there's been some discussion around 10 years. If you were looking at 10 years, I would advise you to go for 9, just because there are these psychological thresholds, and when you tick over from a single digit number to a double digit number, it's perceived differently. That would also align you, 9 years puts you on schedule to have a renewal come back in either 2032 or 2034, which would be regularly scheduled elections, less expensive than the special elections. So that would be my recommendation on the duration. And then there's the cost of living adjustment. Your current measure is 3%. I know I've heard some talk of increasing that to 3.5 just to kind of keep up with inflation. I mean, the more you change in a measure, the more scrutiny is going to attract, right? And we're already changing a lot, especially with the methodology change on the tax rate. I would advise, that 0.5% isn't going to be a ton of money if we're only talking about a 9-year measure. If this were an in perpetuity measure, then yeah, that makes a big difference 30 years from now. But I would say that, keep that at 3% for a little more continuity with your current measure. And if you look at most parcel taxes in Marin County, 3% is the cost of living adjustment. And so it's sort of within the norm. And I think for that reason, we'll probably meet with less resistance. And then lastly, the potential uses of funding. The polling says pretty clearly that attracting and retaining teachers is the top priority for the community. As I understand it, that's how you're almost exclusively using your current parcel tax revenue and how you would use this going forward. So attracting and retaining teachers and how that relates to supporting quality educational programming, I think that's kind of the intent and the focus of this measure.
That's super helpful.
That verbiage, the attracting and retaining teachers, I understand what we're saying here, but it makes it seem like we're trying to recruit rather than, we want to pay our teachers more. They deserve more money. So I'm just kind of hoping that we can say that it's about salaries and making it competitive salaries to keep our teachers. I don't know, I keep hearing that same verbiage over again. I just hope we can massage that.
Very standard for
Yeah,
parcel
I
taxes,
know,
like for schools,
I know.
really standard. But
I
I
know.
mean, that's the interesting thing about the messaging. We can do whatever we want with the messaging
Yeah,
and make it clear to people and explain. This is so we can pay our teachers a livable wage.
exactly. This
This is what we've been listening to for the last 2 years in our board
Yeah.
meetings, and we're hearing them and we're trying to help.
That's
So
what I just hope
it's
we could
very-
just sort of give back, like this is what we want to give you back. That's all. That's what I'm thinking.
I agree. I think you're gonna have to be very clear.
What do you think in all of this? I've just sort of taken a lot of notes here. What do you think is going to be the biggest bullet point of scrutiny in this whole mix?
I honestly, I think it's justifying the tax rate. And I mean, you're asking the community here to jump the revenue from 4.5 million to 7.5 million, and I think you have to justify that. I've seen the budget roadshow that Tyler's been doing, and I think he makes a great case for it. And, you are the lowest funded district in the county. Your compensation for your employees is becoming less competitive with every year. And that has consequences, right? At some point you start losing your talent, and that has an impact on the quality of education. So I think you have the story you need to make that case. But it's not an insignificant jump in the tax rate.
I think that might be one of the challenges in the messaging is it is an increase in the rate and it's a decrease in tax for 50% of our community as well. So like when you think about an unimproved parcel, that's a tax reduction for that person. If you talk about a person with a family living in a place that's less than 1,800 square feet, I think was the average, the tax rate is actually the bill that they get is going to go down.
It's not going to go down because it's inclusive of the additional 3 million. It's still going to go up. It's going to go up to 998.
It's going to go down relative to what they would pay
Correct.
if it was the same proposal on a per parcel basis.
Right.
Yep.
But it's still there. The number is still going up to everybody.
Yes.
Not to everybody. There will be some homes, my guess, on the lower square footage. Like if you have one of those 1,100 square foot bungalows, your tax rate might go down. I would have to run the numbers to find out exactly what the square footage would be, and I think it's an important bullet point to share with some of the folks. And there's a lot of smaller homes in our area.
And I think, you know, we're asking in terms of how do you simplify the messaging. I think having some kind of case examples of, you know, somebody who lives in a very small bungalow, less than X number of square feet, here's what it would look like for them. Somebody who lives in an average size two-bedroom house or apartment with kids, here's what it looked like. Three kinds of
just three,
general
1,100,
scenarios. No, not 119 of them.
3,000.
No, just a few
Yeah.
kind of examples of what this might look like, I think would be graspable and understandable for people, and tangible, you know, rather than just a bunch of numbers with pictures of these houses or whatever, you know. So I think that simplifying in that way.
And I think that there's communication on a flyer, and then there's, you know, Roadshow 2.0 that has a slide that has those examples in it.
What do you think if we did promote, hey, seniors, the senior exemption, have you seen that number going from X to Y if people do promote that the exemption is possible?
Well, seniors, given that most of them don't have children in the schools, tend to be, you know, one of the more resistant demographic groups. And, you know, the message that, you know, you are eligible for an optional exemption, and I think it's important to explain it as optional so that people feel like that's their choice.
Mm-hmm.
They can contribute if they want to. I've seen that have a dramatic impact. It's hard to quantify, but it'll turn a lot of votes in your favor that otherwise would be no's.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
So virtually all school districts offer a senior exemption for this reason, and I wouldn't consider taking that off the table.
No, I'm just trying to figure out ways of making it easier for the people that are exempted. So the one-time opt-out is great for the next 9 years. They don't have to do something each year. Some of my neighbors said that's really confusing, and they have to pay attention to that. So the easier we can make that, I don't know how we message that, but maybe through the road shows and just conversations.
Yeah, and we have the names and addresses of every voter that's over the age of 65, so we can send them information. There's ways that we can communicate directly to that population.
So you can have targeted communications based on the interests of particular voter populations.
Do we know, was that 25% of that opt-out, do we know what was for the TAM union bond, what opted out?
You can't opt out.
Yeah, bonds don't have
you can't?
exemptions, but I could find out what TAM senior exemption rate is for their parcel tax.
Okay.
I would assume it's similar.
Do you know, so the 25% was 25% of eligible voters, 25%
Residential
of total, like what's the
parcels.
total number of potential, is it 25% of the total potential population that could opt out? Like,
Yeah,
is that what it
so
is?
25% of your residential parcels are currently qualified for the exemption.
Qualified.
Now, I don't know off the top of my head what percentage of your residential parcels are age 65 plus that would potentially be eligible. That 25% is already fairly high, so I would think you probably have a pretty high exemption rate already. And it's important that the senior exemption only applies to a principal residence. So if I'm a landlord, I can't apply for the senior exemption for my, multifamily rental property.
So 25% are eligible or 25% are availing themselves of the exemption?
25% of your residential parcels are currently exempt.
Okay.
exempt.
Currently availing themselves of that exemption. And how many more are qualified but are not availing themselves? Do we know that?
I don't know that number. We could approximate it though.
Okay. Because I'm just thinking if we, because that, like you said, there's a little bit of a catch-22 of yes, you want to let everybody know about it, but that 25% could theoretically increase, and to know what the potential total increase, what's the maximum that it could go up to based on how many parcels are occupied by people who could avail themselves of that might be. I would imagine that's
I think doing a couple simple, like a mailer and a link on our website that has the form and who to contact is enough. And then, before the vote, making sure everybody knows that there is an opt-out and here's how you do it is key. Even if it's an extra 5%, that's not gonna, we're still gonna have a couple $1 million more, 1.5, 1.7, or 2.5, $2.7 million more to pay our teachers. So I don't think that's the like linchpin.
Okay.
But we can definitely make it really clear for folks
Right.
where to do it and who to contact.
I just really wanna make sure that we know what that is, like if it's like 25% are, but it could be 50% and we don't calculate that into the rate that we go for, and then all of a sudden we're not getting the amount that we thought we were gonna get because all of a sudden that bumped way up. It would be helpful to make sure that we know, what the potential increase is for the outreach that we're gonna be doing.
Yep, sure. Yeah, we can run those numbers.
I think we need just to make sure that our communications are very clear and they're very comprehensive to like our entire community.
Yeah.
Because when I was campaigning, I met a lot of people who were seniors who were like, oh, why do you guys need more money? And I had a lot of conversations to try and explain why we probably were looking at doing something like this in the future. And most of them were like very supportive of it once you explained.
Yeah.
And I think every single person who was a little bit critical of having another tax, once you talked to them, they understood, but they just had to understand why we were asking for it and what it was used for. So I think as long as we get the upfront messaging very clear and very open and transparent, I think we're gonna run into fewer problems.
Yeah.
And most of the ones I said, we will always support our schools. We just want to know why.
Mhm.
And I think that's the crux of it. So if we can be very clear, this is what it's going for, I think they'll be supportive.
And the 52 cents versus like 57 cents, 59 cents, that gets us, 52 cents gets us the additional 3 million. I think one of the things we talked about last time, well, what if we just went for 3.5 million or something? Is there knowledge or
Similar to your recommendation of going for 9 years instead of 10, is there any other kind of strategy or thinking around going for 51 cents or 54 cents or 55,
Right.
like that kind of thing?
Yeah. I mean,
In the
I think
actual language that you use on the ballot.
changing from 52 to 51 or 52 to 54 probably isn't going to move the needle a lot in support. It's when you tip over those thresholds that it starts to make a difference. So would 49 or 48 cents improve support? Probably marginally. But anything within that low 50 category I don't think is going to change support. We typically find that with square footage parcel taxes, you see less rate sensitivity. The rate can change more before you see corresponding changes in support. That's not the case in per parcel rates, right? Because when I go from $100 to $150, that's a very tangible difference that people can rationalize. So it's one of the impacts of the square footage is that the cost is a little less obvious.
I've done some back of the napkin math, and I've shared this in the parcel tax slide deck that I have. If you can remember back to where I shared the comparables between Kentfield, Larkspur, Corte Madera, and Miller Creek, and where we stand on a couple different parts of the salary schedule, and there was some of it was the green, about half of it was green, half of it was red. I've run the projections for this year. More is turning red, and I have data for Larkspur, Corte Madera, and Kentfield for next year because they've already settled with their unions, and even more of that image turns red. So what that articulates is that we are losing ground in the way that we're paying teachers, and $3 million would give me enough to go to the bargaining table to turn more of that image green. Not all of it green, but more of it green. And I think for me, that's the rationalization for the $3 million mark, is to be competitive. It doesn't mean we're way out in front of everybody else in terms of pay. It doesn't mean we're paying the same as Reed or Ross with, they're so deep into basic aid, but we're competitive with our comparable districts. And I think that number gets us in that ballpark.
And do we know if those were all parcel versus square footage, those parcel tax?
I believe, and you may know better than I, that I think every parcel tax in the county is per parcel except for Sausalito Marin City, just past a per square foot.
That's correct.
And in your calculations with what you just explained about being competitive and what you know of these agreements that were recently made, were they and have they been in the past such that the 3 million, the additional will not only allow us to be competitive now, but will allow us to be competitive moving forward,
7
such
years.
that we're not going to immediately not be able to keep up with the Joneses with, to be able to, do you feel comfortable that this is
I think we can,
enough?
I think I can project relatively confidently that over the next 2 years, if we do a 2-year settlement, we can turn more of that image that I was talking about green. It's hard to tell. It feels like there's a little bit of an arms race in Marin County. And,
That's what I was getting at.
and I think their districts are gonna start having to have a long look in the mirror about what they're doing. You're seeing districts submit qualified budgets. You're seeing other districts cut the 7-period day at middle school. And I think one thing I've heard loud and clear from our communities is we wanna keep our excellent student programs that we have, in addition to paying our teachers a livable wage. And I think this number gets us there for the time being, but I don't know what superintendents are gonna do around the county over the next 4 years, and if they're gonna slash programs in order to do this because they wanna attract and retain. So I think it's a sticky situation. And I think, there was a IJ article recently about a district that's submitting a qualified budget in part because of what they're doing.
Which is where I was getting
Yeah.
at, was this conversation of, the sweet spot that we're trying to find obviously is how much can we ask that we can get past? Not too much, not too little, that we're gonna, yes, we'll be whole for a while, but are we gonna be back in the hot seat again in a short period? So it's really that balancing act of how much is reasonable that does not jeopardize our ability to pass it, because ultimately it needs to pass. So
Yeah, it's gonna provide firmer scaffolding, at least around our budgeting, right?
Yeah.
Yes.
And we don't know what state budget's gonna look like. We have so many variables
Yeah.
coming into
Yeah.
play here, right?
Yeah.
But at least if we can elevate our own scaffolding to put us in a better position, I think we might be, we're gonna provide better pay. Again, not, out of the park, but at least competitive pay for our teachers. And then hopefully the other factors that go into our budgeting for our pay for our teachers will, who knows where the wind will blow, but this gives us a little more.
Yeah, and I think one thing that I've talked with our union partners about is historically over the last 15, 20, 25 years, compensation increases have typically closely mirrored the cost of living adjustment. Not always spot on, sometimes a little lower, sometimes a little higher. And not until the inflationary period that we just hit recently and the COVID dollars that have hit school districts which has been wonderful to support student learning, have we seen these 8, 9, 10% salary agreements. And I think I'm interested to see where superintendents across the state start going if we start moving back to that more traditional close to COLA agreement, or if we keep doing this, I'm gonna offer 8 and okay, I'm gonna offer 9 and I'm gonna offer 15. It's just not sustainable to be in that place where we've been in over the last few years. All that to say, I'd love to pay our teachers, as much as they like,
One important point related to this conversation of the rate, if we tick up much above 52 cents per square foot, when you apply that to the average square footage, it's going to take it to a number north of $1,000, right? And I do think there's some advantage, just again, based on perceptions, that this is going to cost the average homeowner less than $1,000.
Less than 1,000 is more
I think that's
attractive.
important.
Yeah, I agree.
So I think that feels like we're striking the balance between being aggressive and getting the revenue that we need to support the salary increases that we think are fair, and not burdening our taxpayers with, excess tax. We're really trying to make this a reasonable tax
Yeah,
for our community members.
yeah.
And it's only gonna be under $1,000 this first year. Year 2 at 3%. So it's again messaging.
But that's not a change.
I
That's what
agree,
it's saying.
but just getting it approved, that's a big deal.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just don't, yeah, it's that balance of how do we, I don't want to be here in 4 years. Like, we need another $2 million.
But it sounds like this is that you all have very much appreciate the work and the thoughtfulness and the, you know, attention to all of these calculations to try and thread that. And what I'm hearing is that this feels like what we can do aggressively and meet what we need.
And there are other factors down the road, right? We're gonna do no new demographic study to see how many, you know, little 2 and 3 year olds we have running around our 2 towns. Homes are gonna continue to turn over, which will increase our tax basis, which should help us be more competitive in the future.
Right.
I think the state outlook on the budget, at least recently, is a little better than I think we had assumed, which is good news. And then one of my big hopes is if we continue to flip in and out of basic aid and LCFF, community funded and state funded, that we're increasing enrollment. I mean, I want to increase enrollment. I want this community to understand how great our teachers are, how fantastic our school programs are, and I want to have all of the kids that live in our 2 towns come to our schools. So I think those other factors can help us stay competitive without having to come back and ask for more parcel tax, you know,
That's helpful.
before this one expires. I think that's,
Yeah.
you know, the 9-year term seems fair.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I want to do a quick recap. What I'm hearing Charles say is not having a cap because there's really only 30 parcels that qualify anyways, and only one of them is residential for a single family homeowner. Continue to keep the exemption seems like the right move. Simplifying, not changing as much as we can. We want to make sure our seniors are here in support of this. A 9-year term feels like the right balance between having a good long term, yet something that's, you know,
That's 9 years from 2025-26 tax year.
Yeah, from the year it goes into effect, which would be the coming fiscal year.
great. A 3% inflation cost of living adjustment. And I think those are the main factors. Did I
And
capture?
Parcel
per
versus square
parcel.
foot, and I think that was what we had wrestled with last time, that we were having a difficulty. And mainly, I think it was around, can we simplify the messaging? Not conceptually, I think it makes sense.
Yeah.
From all of the arguments in terms of equity and purpose of the money is based on, anyhow. So I think it's been really helpful to hear kind of how this pans out, and I feel optimistic about being able to have a simplified messaging in that area, and that the calculations that you've made mean that it will still generate the kind of revenue, because that was the other question we had, was if we go here, you know, will we be able to generate the revenue that we are assuming we need? So
Yeah, just listening to you, Charles, I think if we're looking at something for 9 years and the wave of the future is to go to square footage, we're going to look pretty archaic in time by having this parcel per parcel. So it seems to me that we just have to make sure that it's simplified, doesn't confuse. And honestly, you know, the population that really gets confused, you know, are people that don't have kids in the system and are older, right? And if we exempt them anyway, we might be taking that population that's like doesn't want to think about it out of the,
Yep.
you know, I'm just gonna say it. So I really fought against it at first. I was like, make it simple, make it flat. But the equitable argument, I think, is going to help us a lot. I know as a homeowner here, I feel that way. You know, that's where I stand.
I wonder and again, this could just be on the margin, like how many over 65 are currently paying the parcel tax that have a house greater than 1,900 square feet. So they, even though they're paying today, they might opt out because, I've got a 2,400 square foot house. It's optional. I don't have to pay.
that was the question that I was addressing earlier. I think that's the only other variable that I would like to make sure that we look into before we actually nail down, because if you know, it's all assumptions that you have to do in the calculations to put this on the ballot. So if we're gonna have to make some sort of assumption that says 25% now through this campaign, we might expect that to increase by X for new people who
Or
exempt.
if a large percentage of people that are over 65 who are currently opting out have a house smaller than 1,900 square feet because they've been here for 30 years, maybe they might be inclined,
Maybe.
right? Like,
We'll have to make some sort of.
I don't know, if, again, it's
hard to
just,
know.
it's
Yeah.
just margins,
I mean,
it doesn't really.
Just thinking about the demographics of the community, you already have 25% of your residential properties opting out. I can't imagine that more than like 40% of your total residential parcels are over the age of 65. That's probably a really high estimate. So, you know, and you're never going to have 100% participation in the exemption, right? So I think that it will change around the margins, but I don't think it's going to be dramatic.
Yeah.
And then the 3% cost of living adjustment each year, is that on the 52 cent per square foot? Or how do you apply that? Because in year 2, then it's like 1.5 cents. So then am I paying 53.5 cents per square foot?
Yeah, we can write the language of the measure. I mean, one, you can assess it, based on a fraction of a cent, or we can write into the language of the measure that it's going to be the, rate rounded to the nearest cent or something to that effect.
Like your current rate?
Yeah, but it's just the way it works is 3% applied to the tax rate, then applied to all that taxable square footage, less the exceptions.
Does that matter? Does that 3% is 3% if it's per parcel versus per square foot, you're still paying the same thing?
It costs you the same in the end. Yeah.
And I think one of the decisions I'm hearing the board make is that this parcel tax has been voted on, I think 4 or 5 times, so it's been upheld in this community for 30 years. And I think that's important to note that our seniors, our young families have voted yes on this for 30 years. And I think that's really important to note. And I just lost the other point that I was trying to make. Maybe it'll come back to me.
I also feel very optimistic. I mean, I think the solidarity that I'm hearing among all different types of constituents really appreciate the statements that we've heard the past couple of meetings from the teachers union and from other employees and educators and community members, and the feedback and the sense of unity and everyone coming together to make this happen feels like a groundswell of positiveness that's giving me a lot of hope, energy, optimism. So I really appreciate that, and I think it's just going to continue to carry us forward.
So the other point I was trying to make, it's been voted on and upheld for 30 years. The most recent one, we took from a 4% cost of living adjustment and moved it down to a 3%, and this board is recommending maintaining that reduction, not moving back to that old 4% rate. And I think that that's, another sign that we're trying to be really reasonable with this tax and not just go out and get as much as we can. We're trying to be really thoughtful and reasonable here.
And maybe I'm bringing a blanket to a sauna, but I just want to understand what type of guidance, Charles, if from you, how we're going to soldier this. I know that everyone wants to be involved in. Is it so grassroots that we're knocking on doors? Is there an opportunity to perhaps have even an internet presence to talk about this? What type of messaging are we going to be able to use to get this momentum going?
Sure. So there's 2 pieces to that answer. One is what the school district can do in the run-up to the election, and then what you need in terms of a community campaign. Mm-hmm. So you have a window of time from now until shortly after you actually put the measure on the ballot, when the district can use public funds and public resources to communicate factually, here's our budget situation, here's why we need an extra $3 million, here's the consequences if we don't have it. And we can work with Tyler to put together some messaging. And I would encourage the district to do everything it can to get that message out, because that kind of lays the foundation of knowledge for why we're even asking for this. Mm-hmm. Then beyond that, I don't want to underestimate, this is a significant undertaking, any measure that requires a 2/3 vote. And the fact that this is, you're looking to place this on the ballot in a special election means that you also have to think about voter turnout, mm-hmm. right? Because voter turnout on the natural in any special election is going to be quite low. It's usually in the 30 to 40% right. Participation rate range. The key to being successful in these special elections is communicate to those people that are likely to vote, make sure you persuade as many of them to vote yes, but also influence turnout to your advantage by mobilizing supporters to make sure they get their ballots in. And that's where the knocking on doors and the having the face-to-face conversations is important, to identify who your supporters are and then follow up and make sure they actually cast their ballots. But campaigns these days are typically a combination of that type of grassroots outreach, and that's where leaning on your parent groups and your employee associations is really important, because they're the boots on the ground that help you get that done. But in addition to that, direct mail, signage in the community, targeted digital advertising, using the various social media platforms. Campaign should have a website, where you can have that information about the cost and whatnot readily available to voters. And that's part of what we can do is help you put together that strategy from the point we put this on the ballot through to election day. How do we both persuade voters, but also mobilize our supporters to make sure they vote in a low turnout election?
And I don't know what the laws are, but regarding signage in the community, are we allowed to have signage on school campuses for this? We're not.
Not if it advocates.
Okay.
Not if it advocates for the passage of the measure. Yeah, we can't use a public resource in any way to advocate for the measure.
I thought so. I just wanted to make sure, because I know a lot of teachers want to promote this, but I don't. I was just wondering what our parameters were.
Does the clock start ticking on that limitation from the approval? Like this tonight is just a conversation and providing direction. Does the clock start on that from the day that we make an actual decision, or from when it goes on the ballot, which I think you said was like a February 6th?
February 6th,
February
the deadline,
6th.
yeah, I think, but January 29th is when you would actually adopt the resolution, and that's where we're official, we have something on the ballot.
Okay.
So you can never use public resources to advocate for any ballot measure.
Right.
However, when we're in this period where we only have a hypothetical measure at this point, right? There's more latitude in terms of what you can do and what you can say. Once that measure's on the ballot, that's where the scrutiny increases, right? And that's where you want to be very careful that, district staff, when they're on the job, they can provide information, they can't advocate anyway. That goes for, your teachers as well. So they have to be very careful to the extent they're going to be involved in the campaign. They're doing so on their own time, not on district time. Same goes for facilities, district dollars, obviously. We just have to be real careful that any advocacy is privately funded and done so by volunteers that aren't a district resource.
So, but the parents can do whatever.
We don't run into that restriction with parents.
Right.
They can't bring signs onto campus though and wave them there. What they can do is they can, like on the street, out
Have
front,
a table
outside of
out
school.
front at the entrance of the school, perhaps.
As long as it's not on school grounds.
Okay.
Exactly.
Just
What
lemonade
is
stand, table.
what is it that comes what format does our decision making take on February when we have to make the decision? Is it all of is it a formal resolution with all of the formal ballot language that we are approving? Is it terms that then get translated? What does that tell us a little bit about what that looks like?
Yeah, so if we leave here tonight with agreement on what we've talked about, the tax rate, the duration, the cost of living adjustment, Tyler and I will go back and work with the district's legal counsel to put all that into the form of a resolution that basically, puts that before the voters. And it also includes all the language instructing the county registrar of voters to conduct this election on, in May 2025 and whatnot. So that's what you would be considering and approving on January 29th.
Okay.
So substantive, input is really important tonight, where when we come back on January 29th, it's really going to be, a little bit more discussion, maybe some clarifying. But if there's going to be a substantive change on the 29th, would have to have a special board meeting really soon after that in order to meet that February deadline.
We could make minor changes to the resolution on the night, but
Okay,
yeah,
great.
The more we can have this sort of set going into the meeting,
Thank you.
the smoother it will be. Yeah.
Is there any pushback? So I'm looking at the current one, the Measure E, and we went into effect 2020, and it was for 8 years. So 5 years later, we're asking for more money and to renew. Is there any why didn't you guys ask for more then, or why are we doing this sooner? And that was COVID, so everything's foggy. Does that have any impact in people's perception?
Well, this measure would be written to replace the old measure.
Right.
So the old one would go away, this one would take effect. And I think that, given what's happened with salary increases
Right.
and changes in the state budget and COVID dollars going away, and enough has changed that it's reasonable to think that we need to rethink this proposal now.
And maybe that's a good way of
To me, yeah.
some type of communication around that.
I think that for me, there is so much that has changed between 2020 and now in, like you mentioned, I mean, the COVID, the economy, politically, I mean, there's just so many changes. Just to say so much has changed since this was implemented, it makes sense to create a new one without having to get too complicated into the details. And I think that will resonate with all of us who've experienced all that change.
Also, it was 2018 when we did majority.
Yeah, it said it went
So it
into
ran to
effect,
2028. But
the
it-
parcel taxable real estate property beginning July 1st, 2020.
It was 2018 when I worked on that one. It was to renew to 2028, so I don't know if that's a typo or not, but I'm working on that one.
I mean, you need direction, right, Tyler, tonight. I think your recap accurately reflects.
I think the one thing I didn't capture was what I'm hearing Charles suggest is per square foot.
Mm-hmm.
And I think most of the board is in alignment with that suggestion.
Yes.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and having that standard, I just did the math, 1,100 square foot would pay $572. That's a win for X percentage of property owners, whatever those percentages are.
Yep.
1,900 is under 1,000. Okay, that's still a lot. That's 30% more than I'm paying today. But okay.
But less than if it was on a per.
Yeah, so I don't know how we promote that. And then 2,400 square foot would be twice as much as they're paying today. And, you know, whatever, 3,000 square feet is almost 2.5 times what they're paying today, whatever, those numbers. So that's a big difference, right? For a 24 square foot home, they're paying twice as much than they are today. And again, it's not the majority, right? That's where, and it is equitable.
That's where the messaging around what is this, why do we need this,
Yeah.
and what is it going to comes into play. So I think the messaging of why do we need this in terms of paying, paying a living wage, attract and retain. If we don't, what happens comes into play when you're just looking at what are you paying today, what might you be paying tomorrow, and then there's different messaging for people who are asking, like, why are you, it's like the epic, why are you changing it from a per parcel? Then that's a different set of messaging and explanations for that. Why is that changing? Question, which is different than why is it going up? So it's just, that's part of the
When
crafting
Haga
of the
did your
message.
polling, we tested a big set of potential arguments in favor. The most persuasive argument to your voters was having a great teacher in the classroom is the most important element of providing a quality education. This measure will help Ross Valley School District attract and recruit the best teachers to our classrooms. So if we want to make it simple, it's all about having a great teacher in the classroom, right? And that's what this allows us to do.
Yeah.
When we have hundreds and hundreds of emails we've received over the last 2 years to that effect, what we need to do is find those people and be like, hey, come help us, because
Right.
we're ready for
Right.
it.
Right.
Send them my way.
Have you heard of, in terms of the outreach campaign and everything, we had, just really heartfelt and important public comment for 2 years that we have recordings of for all of those meetings that I think are also very important messaging for the community directly in the voice of teachers who are here. So I think that we have all of that as well, which is what we're responding to. So
We haven't talked about transition for communication to like a community-led campaign, so I don't know. Are we ready to move on? Do we have any more terms that you needed to get nailed down? Or?
I think we're good.
I think we got it. So the transition to the community-led campaign, again, the district can't be involved in that process. It has to be separate. But, through all the conversation you all have had over the last couple of years, I'm sure there are folks that have emerged that are passionate about this issue. And so what I would encourage is over the next, few weeks, as we're finalizing the measure, qualifying for the ballot, that group start to form and get together and have conversations. It sounds like you have some folks that have been involved in past campaigns. I'm happy to share some recommended sort of organizational structures for how you divide and conquer the different tasks of the campaign. You have to do private fundraising. Your school's foundation and your parent organizations as independent 501c3 organizations can contribute to that campaign. So that's a potential source of funds. Your employee associations, other community donors, that's typically how you raise the dollars to fund the advertising and the signs and the direct mail. Between now and the end of the month, start getting that organization pulled together. Come February, there's going to be some deadlines once the measure's on the ballot for submitting the official argument in favor of the measure that gets published in the ballot pamphlet. So that advocacy group will need to draft an argument, and you can have up to 5 people sign on to that with their names and titles. That's an important group to show broad-based support for the measure, and then start working to put together a campaign plan. So,
Did you just say that the official argument in favor also has a deadline of February 6th?
It's not February 6th. I don't know the date off the top of my head. It's going to be in about mid-February.
And how important is, I'm just thinking of the last campaign, and you read through your booklet and you see what you're voting on, and then you see the for and against, and that's what you're talking about is those statements.
Exactly.
That's actually in the voter pamphlet.
Yeah.
How much influence do you think that has on success?
I think it's important. Every single registered voter is going to receive that booklet, and in this special election, it's going to have one issue in it, right? So it's not like the big, thick booklet we get before the general election. It's going to have one issue. And there's an opportunity for opponents to have a statement in there. So at the very least, you want to make sure you've countered that. It's free to the campaign. They don't charge you anything to be able to send something to every registered voter. So I take advantage of it.
So is that date set? I'm looking for that online. Is there a special election date?
Well, yeah, I don't think the county has released a calendar for this May's election.
It's a county decision.
Yeah,
okay, cool.
Yeah. County Registrar of Voters is what administers the
And then
election.
do we know what else is going to be on that?
Nothing that I know of. I think this would be the only item on the ballot.
For our jurisdiction?
Yeah. Okay.
What are the potential opposition things that we would need to be thinking about or be mindful of, either groups or whatever that would possibly create one of those opposition things, or just be out there in the community?
Sure. Usually opposition to measures like this is just simply anti-tax, and people may make the argument that we're already taxed to death with all these other taxes that have been proposed. So I think that's where you just need to be prepared to justify why we need this funding, and without it, what the consequences would be. There's a fairly active anti-tax group in Marin County that you might want to meet with if you haven't done so already, and have some conversations with them. And they tend to like these square footage type parcel taxes, so you're structuring something that I think they could probably live with. But that's just going to require some conversation to hopefully reduce their motivation to oppose you.
Rachel, you've been involved in a lot of these. Do you have anything that we're not thinking about that we should be thinking about with respect to this segment of the campaign?
I'm mostly just thinking of getting that community group formed and having them ready to take the reins and kind of run with it. For me, that seems to be the lead priority. I think the terms that we've agreed on are pretty much everything I would have requested. Mm-hmm. I think that that's going to be really key.
Once that group is formed, what can board members do and not do with respect to that group in terms of yes or no holding leadership positions, only attend things in the evening? What are those kind of things that need to be thought about in terms of?
Yeah, so you all as board members have more flexibility than Tyler, for example, right? Because you're not full-time employees of the district, so you have more time flexibility. So you can be involved in the campaign as long as you're not using a district resource. So, if you have a district issued email address, don't use that for campaign communication, use your personal email address. Don't hold campaign meetings in a school district owned office, do that at somebody's home or, some private facility. So it's really just making sure that you're not using a public resource. I've heard concern about, well, can 5 board members attend a campaign meeting, or is that a Brown Act violation? I mean, technically, the Brown Act only applies to business that would come before the board, and campaign business obviously can't, because districts can't campaign. But with that said, you probably want to be careful that you're not creating perceptions of impropriety. So, maybe have 2 board members that are going to attend those meetings, even if all 5 are involved in the campaign in some fashion.
That is what they did in 2018. There were 2 designated board members who were part of the campaign, but they were not the leads on the campaign, but they were there. They did a fair amount. So.
Is there strategies on people that have kids in high school or college, so in our district, but they're no longer in our district, versus Tamalpais, everybody's eventually going there, so okay, I can get behind that. Is there some?
Yeah, so I think, leaning on some of your sort of alumni parents can be helpful. That's a population that you would hope would be supportive of this to kind of, pay it back. And then, I would also think about having representatives on that campaign committee that are part of the senior population. So you're kind of reaching outside of that, obvious parent group to find tentacles into those, groups and create relationships there to communicate with those populations. The more you can have representation on your campaign committee for kind of all the key factions of the community, business community representation on some level, maybe even, folks that, own rental properties or something like that, then you're opening lines of communications to the full community.
What is or isn't the role of other municipal agencies in our community in something like this to be kind of in solidarity and showing like we are one community, whether we're the fire department, the police department, the town, the county, that we are all in this together for all of our kids? Or is that something that is not typically done?
So they can't use public resources to advocate for your measure either. What they can do though is their elected boards or councils can adopt resolutions of support, just taking an official position of support. So I don't know if you did that for Tamalpais's bond measure last year, but you could have, and they could adopt a resolution supporting your parcel tax, just going on record as supporting this. That's about the only way as public agencies they can support your efforts.
But the TAM union PTA could promote or advocate.
They can, their schools foundations can as well, yeah, because those are independent organizations. It's not part of the school district.
That's helpful, thank you.
You can seek endorsements from their board members, other leaders within the district. Endorsements are key. Having a broad list of people that support this, it just creates a sense that, okay, people that I know and respect are supporting this measure.
Mail-in votes versus in-person day of, is there
So it's a special election, it's mail-in only.
Mail-in only?
Yeah.
So that could be whatever time those mailers are sent, so we would have to work back from that date.
Yeah.
The ballots are mailed to all voters 29 days before election day. So basically back up a month, so it'll be beginning of April. What we find typically is the vast majority of the ballots, they're returned by mail, but they're returned by mail at the end of the voting period. People just tend to procrastinate in that way. So strategically, the campaign will need to think about the timing of its communication. So, but throughout that roughly 30-day voting period, that's when most of your key messaging is going out. Also, strategically for the campaign, it's a public record as to whether each and every registered voter in your district has returned a ballot or not. So if you're smart as a campaign and you've built a good database of who your supporters are, you could track and see if they've returned their ballot and follow up with them if they haven't until you see that ballot come in. So there's some strategies in these special elections that help you influence turnout that's harder to do in the big general elections.
That's good to know.
Any other questions or thoughts?
And then since we can't use district resources, obviously, when do your services stop? When we put the resolution on, or when Like when we approve the resolution, or when we put it on February 6th, or when does that happen? Just so I know when it transitions over.
My contract is scheduled to run for 2 weeks after the qualification deadline, so we can kind of get you on the ballot, do the wrap-up communication related to that so the community knows what's been placed on the ballot. But then that's when my relationship with the school district ends. And so if the community campaign committee were to want us to help advise the campaign, we're available to do that as soon as our district contract is ended.
Well, I really appreciate your insight. This was wildly supportive for me tonight. I think we've had some really good discussions about this, and this just really crystallized and clarified things for me. So thank you.
No problem.
Yes, thank you.
We always have to do public comment before we.
Oh, we did public comment before.
We did that. Thank you.
All right, so do we have any other questions? Did you need anything else from us? All right.
Thank you very much.
Yes.
Sure thing, my pleasure.
Yes, thank you, Charles.
Okay, so moving on to the agenda. With that, it is 7:05 and I will adjourn our meeting.